Ladies and gentlemen, it is now time to invite our keynote speaker. The theme of this year's program is Antidote to Extremism. Reverend Dirk Ficca is currently director of the Interreligious Initiative for Middle East Peace of the Presbytery of Chicago. From 1992 to 2012, Reverend Ficca worked on various capacities with the Council for a Parliament of the World's Religions, serving as executive director for the last 15 years. During his tenure, the Council organized the world's largest international interreligious gatherings with major Parliament events in Chicago, that was in 1993, Cape Town 1999, Barcelona 2004, and Melbourne 2009. Under his leadership, the Council's mission promoted interreligious dialogue, grassroots organizing, and global networking in cities around the world. He has previously served as pastor of the First Presbyterian Church of Benton Harbor in Michigan from 1981 to 1982, and he helped to found Open Skane, an interreligious initiative promoting social cohesion in Malmö, Sweden, formally established in 2014. Please join me in welcoming tonight's keynote speaker, Reverend Dirk Ficca.
To hate and fear, day after day, year after year, it's got to be drummed in your dear little ear. You've got to be taught to hate and fear. You have got to be taught before it's too late, before you are 6 or 7 or 8, to hate all the people your relatives hate. You've got to be carefully taught.
By the time the forces of hate and fear have wreaked their havoc, it is already too late. By the time American Airlines Flight 11 and United Airlines Flight 175 fly one plane after another into the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center. By the time the new visitor to Wednesday night Bible study says you rape our women and you're taking over our country, and opens fire on the pastor and the 8 others gathered there. By the time 3 Israeli teenage young people hitchhiking home are kidnapped and found murdered, and a day after their funerals, a young Palestinian teenager is kidnapped and murdered in retaliation. We all know the all too familiar litany. By the time the school goes into lockdown, by the time the bomb goes off at the rally, in the marketplace, outside the stadium. A month ago, our hearts went out to our Turkish friends and colleagues in the aftermath of the horrific bombing of a Kurdish peace rally in Ankara. Last week, it was a devastating bombing in downtown Beirut, and now it is Paris. Let's be realistic and clear. In the moment and over the short term, so much of this havoc is beyond our control. By the time it happens, it's too late. So then what do? We go after the bad guys, We do whatever it takes to make sure this never happens again, even if it means there is collateral damage. Even if it means the cycle of hate and fear continues. Is this the antidote to extremism? That's a question. At least in the short term, maybe, maybe not. But what about over the long haul? As devastating and tragic as these manifestations of hate and fear are, there is something more dire and ominous about extremism, more threatening and far-reaching than the worst that any murderer or terrorist cell or armada of evil can do. It is when extremism moves from the margins to the center. It is when extremism moves from the margins to the center. When that happens, extremism can poison the well of our entire society. It can drive a wedge between people of goodwill. It can pit us against each other. In the words of Yeats from his poem, The Second Coming, things fall apart. The center cannot hold. Mere anarchy is loosed upon the world. When hate and fear becomes the order of the day, we resort to dividing the world up into us and them. Respect for differences morphs into self-righteous intolerance. Sacrifice for the common good is replaced with rabid self-interest. Most terrifying is when those victimized by extremism unwittingly become proponents of the same blinding untruths and perpetrators of equally inhumane behavior. Given that all that can be done in the name of extremism, this is the worst of all possible outcomes. And unfortunately, maybe you share my concern that we're beginning to inch into that territory. But having reached the worst of all that is seemingly possible beyond our control, we get a sense of what our response can be. Even in the face of extremism at its worst, we can decide not to let it bring out the worst in us. For how we respond to extremism and respond together is within our control. There's a funny little story about tourists in a What is the best way back to Edinburgh? The farmer thought for a moment. He looked down the road this way. He looked down the road that way. My best advice is to start from somewhere other than here. In this most frightening of times in our nation and in our world, where there appears to be only polarization and no center to hold us together, what is the best way back to sanity, to civility, and to the common good? How do we start from somewhere other than here? Well, for starters, we can change the way we talk about each other. At the margins, there has always been and always will be disparagement of the other, demagoguery, and hate speech. But the alarm should go off when that kind of rhetoric becomes more acceptable in the mainstream of public discourse. Surely, as a nation, we can consider the appropriate need to govern our borders and to employ an orderly process for those who want to become U.S. citizens, without demonizing those who are already here and those who want to come here in the future. Without naming names, we've heard a leading candidate for president play on the anxieties of a silent majority of Americans who are afraid of losing our country. Using over and over and over again the same unquestionably horrific but singular anecdote of the brutalization and murder of a woman in San Francisco by a criminal from Mexico who came to the United States illegally. By using this anecdote over and over again, this candidate has succeeded in impugning the character and motives of the Mexican people in general. And this kind of rhetoric threatens to set the tone for the current debate. By the way, this same unnamed candidate said, listen carefully, "My grandparents didn't come to America all the way from Germany to see it taken over by immigrants." Advocate for whatever immigration policy you want, no problem. But do you have to demonize an entire people in the process? Surely we can distinguish between the murderous, marauding bands of ISIS and Al-Qaeda and Boko Haram from the Muslim family that has moved in down the street. The Muslim family who attends Jummah prayer at noon on Friday at the mosque across town. The Muslim parents who are teaching their children not to hate and fear, but to live a morally disciplined and peaceful, loving life, as Allah, gracious and merciful, would have them live. As argued in a recent editorial in the Chicago Tribune, the common assumption is that Muslims are not only monolithic, but united behind the most extreme and violent members of their religion. A presidential candidate who will not be named voiced that sentiment when he told an interviewer it wasn't people from Sweden who blew up the World Trade Center. No, and it wasn't people from Iran and Afghanistan or Saudi Arabia who blew up the federal building in Oklahoma City in 1995 or killed 5 people with anthrax-laced letters in 2001. Or assassinated a Kansas abortion doctor in 2009. Every religion has its radical elements, Islam included. But the great majority of Muslims here and abroad do not endorse or engage in violence. 8 out of 10 American Muslims say violence against civilians in defense of Islam is never justified. By our means, let us join together with the overwhelming majority of the 6 million Muslims residing in the United States and the 1.2 billion Muslims around the world. Let us join with them in decrying acts of terrorism and violence done falsely in the name of Islam. But there is no need to demonize our Muslim neighbors or slander Islam in the process. Now, I have to admit, however, how easy it is for a negative stereotype or prejudicial view of others can sneak up on you. A number of years ago, I attended the annual meeting of the Kentucky Council of Churches to speak about fostering dialogue and cooperation between diverse religious communities. Standing in line for lunch one day, I found myself among a group of pastors and other educators who did ecumenical and interreligious work across the state. Now, we were all clearly liberal, politically and religiously, coming from mainline Protestant denominations, Methodist, Presbyterian, Lutheran, UCC, Episcopalian. There might have been a Unitarian among us. One of the local pastors engaged in this kind of work lived in a small town with 7 churches. He told us that each of the churches had made a decision to host a refugee family. The Southern Baptist ended up hosting a family from Cambodia. With a smile, he said, Of course, the family from Cambodia are all Buddhists. It's interesting to watch these Southern Baptists learn that Buddhists are human beings too. While being liberal types, we all chuckled and nodded our heads. This was a good lesson for the Southern Baptists. But my friends, he was setting us up. He went on to say, what's just as interesting is that the rest of us are learning the same thing about Southern Baptists. One way or another, none of us is immune. We all have this tendency to divide the world up into us and them. It takes a never-ending vigilance and discipline to see the humanity in others, regardless of sex, age, race, ethnicity, nationality, disability, sexual orientation, gender identity, economic status, social standing, religious affiliation, or political opinion. To see the humanity in a young woman who decides to terminate an unplanned pregnancy in the hopes that at a future day she will be in a better position to more responsibly care for the precious life of a child. To see the humanity in a couple that decides to give birth to a child whose deformities means only days or weeks of inevitably difficult and short-lived, but nevertheless precious life. To see the humanity in the pacifist who welcomes home the soldier from the war the pacifists opposed, and the humanity in that same soldier who felt called by our country to defend the pacifist freedom to oppose that war. Yes, there is a kind of ambiguity in these decisions and stances, but there's also a kind of certainty in them as well. From the extremist perspective, it is difficult, if not impossible, to hold the ambiguity and the certainty together. But if we want to avoid the pitfalls of extremism, we must and can hold them together. And in doing so, we hold on to our humanity and our ability to see the humanity in others. And in order to do that, we must not confuse the right to hold our own conviction with the claim that others must see it our way. Now, you can all imagine a person who is firm in their convictions but open-minded. A person who thinks for himself or herself but is willing to consider other points of view. Who wants their own voice to be heard and to be taken seriously, but makes room for other voices as well. It strikes me that this is one reason why Pope Francis was so well received during his recent visit to the United States. Firm in his Catholic convictions, no doubt, yet open to others who did not share his convictions, both non-Catholics and Catholics alike. Likewise, you can imagine a person who is firm in their convictions but not open to other points of view. In their view, others are not entitled to their own beliefs, to live their lives in their own way. It is their way or the highway. And in their effort to impose their worldview on the rest of us, the extremists may resort to all sorts of things to get their way, inflicting enormous damage in the process. Though in the short term in Ankara, in Beirut, in Paris, the extremists may get their way. Over the long haul, in terms of winning the hearts and minds of their fellow human beings, they will never succeed. Because a person convinced against their will is not convinced. Only a person who is freely persuaded. That's why persuasion rather than coercion is at the same time the most powerless and the most powerful force in the world. Which brings us to the most difficult part of the journey, from a polarized and breaking apart world to a place of healing, of getting along. The monumental task of letting go in order to move forward, of ending the vicious cycle of hate and fear with us, and starting a virtuous cycle of understanding and respect for those who come after us. And needless to say, my friends, this is a tall order. To let go of justifiable anger, to forgive the unspeakable, to work on behalf of the well-being of those who have wished you ill, requires enormous courage, strength, and resolve. No wonder this heroic moral and spiritual struggle is a chief occupation amongst all the world's religions. God only knows we need all the help we can get when it comes to letting go and moving on. But that's what so many at Mother Emanuel AME Church in Charleston, South Carolina. But that's what so many at Mother Emanuel AME Church in Charleston, South Carolina have decided to do in the wake of the shooting of their pastor and 8 members of the congregation. As reported in the Washington Post, the relatives of people slain were able to speak directly to the accused gunman at his first court appearance. One by one, those who chose to speak at the bond hearing did not turn to anger. Instead, while the alleged shooter stood impassive, they offered him forgiveness and said they were praying for his soul, even as they described the pain of their losses. I forgive you, Nadine Collier, the daughter of 70-year-old Ethel Vance, said at the hearing, her voice breaking with emotion. You took something very precious from me. I will never talk to her again. I will never ever hold her again. But I forgive you. And God have mercy on your soul. Imagine for a moment that the world is overrun with a terrible plague of global proportions, threatening the human race with extinction. Millions are dying, and millions more are gripped in fear and despair. And in the ensuing chaos, people are taking sides. People are at each other's throats. Imagine now that those of us in this room had the formula for the antidote. What would our responsibility be? Would it not be to share the formula? Would it not be to use it? When it comes to the plague of extremism, we can take the worst this epidemic can throw at us, and with the best we have in us, transform it into something very different. As was mentioned earlier by several eloquent speakers, we can work to lessen the conditions that contribute to extremism in the first place. We can stand in solidarity with and care for those who suffer because of it. We can work to create the conditions that can transform fear into understanding and hate into respect. And most of all, we can do this focused on the next generation. We can say the hate and fear ends with our generation as we pass it on to the next. Yes, hate and fear is passed from generation to generation, yet the opposite is true. My father's generation did not have to battle the derogatory stereotypes of Italian immigrants as wops and dirty dagos and mafia gangsters that his parents who passed through Ellis Island had to endure. I was not burdened with the racial stereotypes of African Americans that my parents' generation carried. For my 2 sons now, Islamophobia is baffling. Through the efforts of the present generation, the vicious cycle of hate and fear can be slowed or stopped, even turned around for the next generation. If, as the song says, you've got to be taught to hate and fear before it's too late, you can also be taught to love and respect. And when it comes to the next generation, my friends, it is never too late. So let me close with this. Ihab Khatib. Ihab Khatib was a rock-throwing Palestinian youth during the first Intifada in the early 1990s. In his encounter with Israeli soldiers, he was beaten so badly that instead of being hauled off to prison, he ended up in hospital. The only silver lining to this was that it enabled Ihab to leave the region. He was able to go and study abroad. He ended up working for the United Nations and then for relief and development organizations internationally. He has since returned to his troubled homeland to work in partnership with a young Israeli, Lior Frankenstein. Together, they are introducing young and upcoming Israeli and Palestinian politicians, diplomats, and governmental officials to each other, building a sense of trust between them and giving them the skills to negotiate the contentious relationship between their two peoples. Recently, over dinner in East Jerusalem at a restaurant there, where Ihab now lives with his wife and 2 children, he told me this story. In Israel, each year, there is a National Day of Remembrance. At noon on that day, sirens go off in Jerusalem and all over the country. Israelis stop, stand, and observe a moment of silence in the memory of the Holocaust. Ihab can afford to send his children to a private school where the teachers are Israeli. And on the most recent Day of Remembrance, he asked his 13-year-old daughter, "Did you hear the siren today? Do you know what it means? Did your teacher stand in a moment of silence? Did you stand?" His daughter said, "I thought about it, but I did not stand. I know the Jewish people have suffered, but we have suffered too. When Israelis stand with Palestinians in our suffering, I will stand with them in theirs." Ihab told his daughter that he understood what she was saying and that she had made a wise decision. Later in the day, Ihab asked his 8-year-old son the same questions. His son said, "Of course I stood. You have to remember that people suffered and died. You have to stand with them, no matter who they are." Ihab told his son that he understood what he was saying and that he had made a wise decision. My friends, there is a lot of wisdom there. With the daughter, with the son, with the father. My friends, how can we make this kind of wisdom mainstream? Thank you very much.